Well, hello, folks, and welcome to my second video in this Gaming Through Sporting History video series, where today we're looking at rugby union. Now, as I said in the sort of intro and first video of the series, rugby union is one of those sports that simply doesn't seem to transpose well onto the gaming world. There aren't many playing rugby games, and there are even fewer managing rugby games. And it's interesting because rugby operates, albeit to far different budgets and expectations, in a very similar way to football, you might say. You have, formations of a type. Like, yes, it's not sort of 3-5-2 versus, 4-3-1-2, whatever. But all of the sort of technical, tactical inputs that you have with football, you could well have in a rugby game. And similarly, away from the sport, again, like I say, the numbers are very different. But building a club, building a rugby club, could be as every bit as an interesting and engaging game as building a football club. But for various reasons, and I suppose commerciality is one, rugby is just not as much of a supported game as football, let's say. It's not a genre that has really kicked off. So this is a rare a rare rugby union management game. It's a fun game, but it is a creaky game. And here's a screenshot from Rugby Union Team Manager 2017. And as you can see, graphically, you know, it could be better. It could be better. But more than that, how does it simulate its gaming world? How does history look in this sport, in this game? And that's what we're focusing on today. So this is the world we're looking at. So we're looking at what, 8 years from 2017 to 2024. And we have sort of three centers of power, if you like, when it comes to rugby, which is true enough of the real world. You've got the Southern Hemisphere and you've got the Northern Hemisphere. In particular, you've got the British Isles and France and Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. Now, Rugby Union Team Manager 2017 is sort of licensed. So, that's one thing that we're going to have to be aware of as we go through the game. It has the English Premier League. It has the French first and second divisions. But it has in the Southern Hemisphere, it isn't licensed, so the teams aren't actually represented. The names are similar. you know, it's like going back to Pro Evo and having like London Whites or whatever. Um, so the names are mixed up. The players are broadly representative, but it's far less accurate than it might be because of that lack of licensing, which I think is always hinders a game. It always makes it feel a little trickier to have faith in the authenticity of the simulation when, so much of the key elements of the game, the players and the teams are simply not built to be accurate representations of how they are in real life. Now, of course, again, that's a gameplay decision, that's a commercial decision. It doesn't mean the game is any less interesting if your focus is on developing a club and developing players in a way. It might be nicer to simply do that where you aren't tied to your prejudices of knowing those players from the real world. But at the same time, particularly in what we're looking at, and I think what a lot of players of these sort of games are looking at, is exploring what might have been, taking that small club, making it great. And all of that loses a degree of integrity when there is so much that's kind of made up. But anyway, that's a broad point, and we'll see how that plays out. But this is the IRL that we're looking to represent. So we've got three international competitions we're looking at. We're looking at the Rugby World Cup, where South Africa have won it twice. We're looking at the Six Nations, which is going on as I put this together in early 2025, where Ireland have picked up, a few. Six Nations has been largely mixed, but it has been spread out a fair bit. And then the Rugby Championships, or the Southern Hemisphere competition, which have been somewhat dominated by New Zealand. IRL for the domestic competitions. Well, one thing to say is that this game is janky. There's no doubts about it. It's a jank fest. And one of the bugs is that quite often, and I don't think it's random, I think it happens every year, is that a team will qualify for the top tier and the second tier European competition. So hence why I've only gone with the top European Cup and not the for the second tier competition, because they will qualify for both, they will play in both, and they will play both competitions, and they will accrue both results in both competitions. So, if you've got a group stage where you're playing 6 games, the one team will play 12. So they'll likely always qualify, even if they've had a even if they've had a shocker. Um, they likely have got enough points, haven't played twice as many games as anyone else to get into the knockout stages, and then yeah, you can end up with a team winning both the top and second tier. So we've just avoided that. So anyway, we've got 2 domestic competition to look at. You've got Super Rugby, you've got the European Cup, which yeah, again, dominated by New Zealand domestically in the Super Rugby Crusaders. You've got a couple of competitions there with the sort of like curtailed and altered because of the pandemic. And again, that's not represented in game, as you can well imagine. So so there's some misses there in terms of the sort of core competitions. European Cup, well, you've got French clubs who have dominated in recent years, English clubs, and Leinster as the lone Irish side who have won in this conference. So again, we're going to be looking at the clubs and the nations that have dominated and see how closely they relate to the real world. And then you've got the domestic Northern Hemisphere competitions, the English Premiership, top 14. Again, you've got one that's curtailed there due to the pandemic, and the Pro 12. So this is what we're going to see how close we get to in terms of representation. So a few things stand out. Saracens picking up 3 titles in the English Premiership, Stade Toulousain having a dominant run in France, and Leinster and Irish clubs more generally having a dominance in the Pro 12, which is the sort of Scottish, Welsh, and Irish competition. Stormers there in brackets because obviously during this period we have the expansion to include South African teams in the Pro 12, which doesn't happen in the game. So Stormers win in 2022, but they can't win IRL. So we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But again, obviously things that the game simply can't have foreseen and therefore have included in the game in terms of like competition changes and team amendments, whatever it might be. So 3 things we're going to look at: Kiwi regional domination, South Africa on top of the world, and the rise, fall, and rise again of Saracens. So Kiwi regional domination, as we've seen, IRL, they've dominated in terms of like the domestic and the international scene in the Southern Hemisphere. However, South Africa, they've won both World Cup. And they won, so those are 2 dominant teams really in world rugby. And then in terms of the domestic competitions, the rise, fall, and rise again of Saracens, really we're just looking at how teams have fared over the period. But one story of this period that's notable for anyone in the United Kingdom is the fate of Saracens. Dominant side, fantastic side, success domestically and in Europe, but financial woes came their way, corruption and other things in terms of how they were manipulating salaries and fees, etc., in order to, kind of circumvent salary caps. And anyway, ended up in the team being automatically relegated, and they've had to come back again, which they have largely succeeded in doing. But we're going to sort of look at the major domestic teams over this time period and see who is going up and down over the period. So, number 1, Rugby Championship, regional domination. Well, IRL is at the top there, very basic. Blue being New Zealand, they've won mostly everything, with a couple of championships going to South Africa. This is the spread in game. So the All Blacks, clearly not dominant. Clearly not dominant. Not an even spread, but New Zealand and Australia more or less sharing it 50-50. more or less even, really, in terms of their titles. Slight skewing towards the All Blacks, with South Africa being the third most successful side. So how accurate is that? Well, meh, okay. Nothing stands out. No side has totally dominated. Slight more success going to New Zealand, but ultimately a far more even competition in terms of how that's played out for sure. And then, looking at the individual playthroughs, you can see that there's not really much in the way of trends in that first playthrough. Uh, New Zealand start off quite strong. Australia had a good run second playthrough. They win three in a row, but ultimately it is a fairly even competition, and New Zealand simply haven't stepped up in terms of dominance as they have done in the real world. And Australia haven't had that decline. I mean, I suppose that's the thing that we'll come back to. Like, Australian success at the sort of international elite level has definitely, subsided during this period, and that hasn't been replicated in the game where Australia have continued to be a dominant competitive force in international rugby. Now, Super Rugby is, and I'm sorry to say this, it's a bit of a mess. And when we, in the introduction the uh, to the whole series, kind of talked about how gaming through sporting history is very similar to gaming through history, the first series, and that we're kind of exploring that game play and game development loop, whereby you start off by saying, this is the period of history or the sport that I'm passionate about. How then does that need to be represented in game? And then you kind of get into the sort of feasibility of how those different features come together and how they're implemented and your technical abilities and blah, blah, blah. And then slowly you get an evolution in terms of how history is being represented, or in this case, how sport is being represented. One thing you don't expect to see, though, is really bad technical errors. So Super Rugby is a franchise sport. There isn't promotion and relegation. Like, the teams that are involved do change, and they certainly have changed over the period, but it isn't as simple as promotion and relegation. But in the game, there is. There is promotion and relegation. And so in the first place, for example, you get down to the bottom and you see Central Coast, which I think is the Waves. In the second playthrough, you've got Velcom, who I think are, the Velcom Griffins. So these are teams that, as I said at the outset, it's not a licensed game. So, in brackets is their sort of real world team name, and not in brackets is what they appear as in game. So, Durban is the Sharks, and North Peninsula the Blues, Waratahs, etc. Yeah, but you get consistently, quite consistently, there are teams coming from local domestic rugby that are coming through and then winning at the elite level, and that just can't happen because of the franchised nature of Super Rugby, and this is an error repeated throughout the game. So you do have some interesting standouts there with a couple of titles to Central Coast, to the Waves, and to the Griffins. So for the fans of the Griffins and the Waves out there, congratulations, you're winning Super Rugby. But it really does undermine the integrity of the simulation when errors like that are present. And yeah, in terms of the spread, well, the top is basically IRL teams from New Zealand. They've won every competition over this period, but similar to the international competitions we just looked at for the Southern Hemisphere, it's a very even spread between Australian, New Zealand, and South African sides, with Australia coming out on top this time with 9 victories. The South Africa's 8 and New Zealand's 7. So New Zealand, if anything, slightly behind in terms of the spread there. So again, errors don't help it, but a less accurate representation of how things have played out. And again, it is a competitive competition. I mean, the Crusaders, it's quite an incredible run that they've been on. So it's not an unrealistic representation to say that more teams and more nations should have been winning titles. But yeah, so sort of the integrity of it is undermined by the errors in the implementation of the competitions. But an interesting spread there, and one that is, as you can see, far more even than in real life. Going to the Northern Hemisphere now, going into the regional competition. So at the top, we've got IRL, top right. So over the period, Ireland are top, having won 3 titles. England 2, Wales 2, France 1. Down below how it plays out in the game. England are on top with 7, Ireland 4, Wales 4, France 4, Scotland 3, Italy 2. So again, not dissimilar to what we've seen from the Southern Hemisphere, a lot more even, a lot more even. In this time frame, England stand out. But again, you go into and for those of you who watch the cricket video, it's interesting that this has happened again because in one playthrough, England in the cricket playthrough in the cricket campaigns, England had one playthrough where they dominated the Ashes, and in this game, similarly one playthrough where England have dominated the Six Nations. Look at that. So it is number 2. So France win in 2017, but England win 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the trot, and then 6 in total over the period. And bearing in mind that across the 3 campaigns they only win 7, the vast majority of England's Six Nations wins come from that one playthrough, which is very interesting and makes you wonder again about the integrity of the simulation if it can be that extreme. It's like what were the underlying conditions that changed there? Don't really know without looking at it in more detail, which I'm just not really going to do. But yeah, does ask a bit of a question there as to how that. I mean, again, you play more. I've only played 3. If I'd have gone on to played 303, it would be a far more accurate representation, if you like, about how the game is doing things. But there is a real degree of randomness there that has seen England so dominant in win playthrough and basically not involved, not winning at all in the others. Um, but yeah, not unlike the Southern Hemisphere experience, very, much more competitive in the game than in real life in a way. Although having said that, look, Ireland are top, having only won 3 compared to 2, 2, and 1. So it's not like one side is dominating the Six Nations during this period. But to see Scotland and Italy also being really, but then Italy, see, they've won twice, but again, it was one campaign. So it's just a bit streaky. The simulation's a bit streaky. There isn't kind of an internal integrity to it, you might say. It's just a bit streaky if certain conditions are met. So yeah, Italy win 2 campaigns again in one playthrough. Scotland won 3, and what are we looking at? So yeah, so in the same campaign, in the same playthrough where Italy won 2, Scotland won 2. So it's interesting that we've got one campaign which is even, and if you say quite realistic, you say campaign 1 where it's Wales, Ireland. The second is very much England focused, and the third one, I don't know, a little more underdog. So I think we're getting an impression that the simulation for international sport, particularly in the game, is pretty streaky, pretty streaky. And not dissimilar to the European Rugby Champions. Yes, it's sort of a pretty wild spread. So at the top again, we've got winners by nation. So IRL at the top, half of titles for this period won by French teams, that's the purple bit. And then you've got English and then Irish. So the scale is obviously different because we're looking at IRL, we're looking at 8, whereas in the game we're looking at 24 winners. England with a similar chunk, if you like, about a third of winners going to England. But then again, just a lot more competitive, quite a spread. And we even have some Scottish winners in there. We've got a couple of winners for Edinburgh in that first playthrough. One standout, no, Stade Toulousain. I'm a real Stade Toulouse fan, and I was really interested to see how they would perform. Nothing at all. Nothing at all. Yeah, very disappointing output for them. over the course of all three playthroughs. Swaziland just did not get over the line. One standout there, right in the very bottom right, Scottish. So outside of the top leagues in England at least, again, it's not licensed. So Scottish is London Scottish, and they've come through and actually have a remarkable campaign. That third campaign, London Scottish, won all manner of competition. But yeah, all the way to winning in 2024. So if you like, that's the one standout in terms of a really oddball result. I think you could when you look across the other teams, it's all plausible, but again, it's very streaky. There isn't any team that really stands out as having had a consistent, a consistent time with it in terms of, performance in in continental competition. So yeah, streaky. I think again we can kind of say that the simulation is pretty streaky with an awful lot of sort of factors underneath the surface that don't lead to consistency in the simulation. Now, World Cup, and you'll see from the the pie chart that again, the most consistent thing is the inconsistency. And you'll also see that it's every other year. Unfortunately, this is another error in the game, every other year. So we've got a lot more World Cups for a start, which is fun. But just again, very, very streaky. Playthrough one, Australia, France, Scotland, England. Playthrough South Africa, Australia, England, Ireland, South Africa, New Zealand, Italy. So Italy winning a World Cup in 2024. I mean, that certainly stands out. Again, you'd say that these aren't unrealistic representations. Again, not unlike cricket, rugby is sort of a fairly closed community in terms of elite teams. But certainly, again, bearing in mind that South Africa have won both of the World Cups over this period, they only managed to win 2 across 3 campaigns and 3 playthroughs and 24 total. 12 total possible World Cup wins. So again, I think we're just getting that impression, aren't we, that the simulation is streaky. There isn't much of an internal consistency there. And in this case, yeah, is there a team that's actually won every year? No. No, there's not a team that wins a World Cup in each year. Yeah, yeah. So England do come out on top with 3 wins. But yeah, not a very significant dominance there. There's nothing consistently coming through from that particular set. So when we bring all this together, what does it say? Well, here we've got a table that's on the left is IRL. So World Cup wins, continental wins, and total. So in terms of international competition, who are the most successful teams? And on the right, we've got in-game. Now, of course, the biggest difference is Australia. Yeah, as we said, Australia have not had a successful period of it during this particular time set. In the game, that is not the case. Quite the opposite. They come out with 9 continental wins, 2 World Cups, and I've attributed a points value to those to give them 130. So that is a massive split. England also massively overperformed. They've gone from 2 continental to 3 World Cups and 7 continental, so they're significantly up the table. South Africa, so they sit in 4th overall. So they've had a sort of a good but not so dominant performance, and New Zealand also. They performed well in the regional level, but didn't have those World Cup wins. So basically, I gave 20 points for a World Cup win, 10 for a continental. So that does place New Zealand as sort of the third most successful side during the period. Yeah, I mean, a couple of standouts. I mean, obviously Italy do get some competition wins in the game, as does Scotland. Um, I think that, I mean, obviously the biggest standout there is, and but it's not. You wouldn't say that the game is wrong to have not simulated Australia being pretty bad during this period, because Australia is a dominant force in world rugby, has been for generations, and that drop off, it was not to isn't necessarily to have been expected. So I don't think we can really criticize the quality of the simulation there for having Australia perform so much better. Um, but I but you do wonder about the integrity when it is so spread. Like there really isn't a concentration there. Obviously you do have those top four elite teams: Australia, England, New Zealand, South Africa. I mean that is a decent representation of world rugby, you might say, but certainly Ireland and France underperforming, you might say, with Scotland, Wales, and Italy just holding their own. So I think there's a degree of consistency there. There's a degree of integrity and believability, but yeah, there are some standouts that kind of go to that lack of consistency that we've kind of talked about through the other simulations, and that is again laid out when we look at domestic competition. So you're looking at European Elite League. So down in the bottom left, we have IRL. So we've gone for domestic and continental competition. Stade Toulousain, Saracens, Leinster, Leicester Chiefs, and Stade Rochelet being the top five. And again, I've just attributed like a score for domestic and continental competition there. And yeah, I mean, take that to the gaming world. And the top five are Glasgow Warriors, FC Grenoble, Munster Saracens, and Edinburgh. So we do have one. We do have one that comes out. We've got Saracens. So, they score exactly the same, actually, 19 points, but they've accrued in over 3 years, over three parallel universes. They've accrued as much success as they did in one IRL. Like again, there's no dominant teams. It's just a bit of an inconsistency there, really. No teams sort of consistently come out to the top. And so we see this quite broad spread of successful teams with a few that are able to have individual playthroughs where they sort of stand out. And it's certainly the case with Glasgow Warriors and Grenoble that have those individual playthroughs that sort of like get them into this sort of elite level. In terms of those top teams and how they perform, well, yeah, Stade Toulousain have a mare, one league, only one league. That's the only success they have. Makes the Chiefs two. Stade Rochelet, no continental success, which has been, the cornerstone of how they've been able to be successful in on this measure, at least IRL. Leinster, again, good but not great, and Saracens. Yeah, so again, I think it just points to a lack of internal consistency, really. Like it isn't it's like the game is very much doing its own thing. Like it isn't particularly well representing the evolution of the sport over the period. It's got enough internal dynamics that it's kind of immediately going off in its quite independent direction. And I think this is what we're seeing really. So in terms of how you might judge that in terms of its consistency, I'm afraid, yeah, it's kind of C's across the board. Yeah, it's kind of good, bad, and ugly across the board. Because to be honest, when you're in the game, it's hard to judge where those consistencies come from. And when you're looking at it from outside with the simulation style that we've done, again, it's hard to understand where the consistencies are in amongst all of that. Regional domination, very even spread. The game doesn't really model Australia's fall from grace. South Africa on top, well, it gets errors. There's errors in the game in terms of how often the World Cup is for a start. And again, it is just very even, feels a little bit scattergun in terms of the teams that do actually rise to the top of elite international rugby. And with the rise and fall, rise, with the rise, fall, and rise again of Saracens in terms of domestic competition, again, it's a little bit scattergun. And playing the game and going into dynamics, I think one of the issues is actually the financial system of the game. You There are salary caps, and you do find that players, I find it really hard to negotiate contracts with players because their salary demands go absolutely through the roof. It's sort of a very, when your elite players want their contracts renewed, their salaries increase absolutely monumentally. And I think basically the computer loses elite players at a crazy rate. So the teams that start the game off as having high quality squads and high quality players very quickly lose them because their contracts aren't renewed, which means they go to all other clubs. So those elite players suddenly they just get spread out across the game, which leads to a very quickly very even playing field. But yeah, again, at that point, the simulation has sort of gone off on its own tangent because the concentration of quality has then just sort of totally dissipated. And I think that's one of the reasons why you do get, again, in the leagues where there are errors, such as the promotion relegation that happens in Super Rugby, you do get those smaller teams actually emerging and becoming quite good because they sort of have the budget flexibility to hoover up some of those elite players. So you do find that a concentration of elite players do end up at smaller clubs, which again is just not a particularly coherent representation of how teams at the top of the sport sort of are going to operate. I mean, obviously they're going to do everything they can to retain their top talent, and smaller budget clubs aren't necessarily going to be able to hoover them up in the same fashion. So there are certainly internal mechanical issues with the game that undermine the simulation. I think that's why we've got to give C's again, because it is just a wee bit scattergun. Now, as the human player, I mean, I found that you can kind of circumvent the salary cap issues quite easily. So you are able to concentrate quality in your side, even if you've had to pay massively over the odds for free agents, etc. But yeah, that's kind of playing the game rather than enjoying the sport. So I think there's yeah, certainly mechanical issues here that are undermining the representation of the gaming world. And that brings us to my overall sort of assessment, you might say, which is unsurprisingly a C. Um, as I've said before, if you're coming to this game from Football Manager, then yeah, it's got a lot of jank and a lot of internal inconsistencies when it comes to its simulation. So yeah, this one in terms of representing sporting history, it's a fun ride, but not one to be laden with insights into how and why the rugby world of the last decade or so has happened the way it has, because this game has sort of a mind of its own. But anyway, guys, thanks for tuning in for this one. Next time, we're going to be moving on to Championship Manager, which is going to be a little multi-video series exploring the sort of elite leagues and all manner of different themes within that game. So thanks for checking in and see you then.